Thank you. All right. Hi, everyone. So I think the title is very long, but self-explanatory a little bit. So we'll jump right into a little bit of an agenda. So I'm going to start with an introduction about myself, kind of why this topic, why I chose this topic and why I think it's important. We'll talk about some of the common goals between product managers, product designers, the intersection of those roles in some cases. And then we're going to go through a little 4 strategies that we can think about in sort of helping to break this tension. So using data as a tiebreaker, balancing the work ahead, design feedback, strengths and weaknesses. And then at the end, I wanted to do a little bit of a peer feedback review. So throughout this, at the end of each of these strategy slides, I'll ask each of you as we're going through these to think about scenarios that you may have experienced or you're experiencing currently, and we can kind of all help crowdsource some advice, right, based on some of these strategies. So think about it as we're going through this, and feel free to stop me with any questions. So why am I talking about this? I have experience with a lot of different designers over my course of my product management career. I'm currently the head of product, and we've gone from 0 to 1 product development through a suite of products. So have dealt with a few designers there. And then previous to that, redesign an entire existing user experience that was a mix of the designer that did it previously and then new designers. So a lot of different personalities there and intention to break. So the objective of this session is really to kind of help employ some strategies and tools for you to lessen that tension and really strengthen that relationship. I think that, anybody at any company sort of has these common goals, right? But thinking about from a product management and design perspective, we want successful product launches. We want to have user satisfaction. We obviously want to meet business objectives so we can stay employed. And I think that part of thinking about these strategies and really this relationship is changing the way that you're thinking about what we do versus the benefits it brings to the organization. So thinking about it from a global, right? Like it affects your day-to-day, obviously, but sometimes taking a step back and thinking about how does this affect the big picture, right? How is this going to help us meet our business objectives or satisfaction or launching these products, and taking a look at it from that different lens at times helps. I feel like sometimes you get stuck in that day-to-day, right? And you're infighting because you just don't like somebody. And maybe taking that step back to look at it from a global perspective. So this is some of the ways that these roles can intersect. And this is from my experience. Everyone's might be different, right? But I think that these are some of the places where tension can get created because there's a little bit of an overlap in these roles. And depending on what frameworks you're using, which companies you're at, these intersections can happen. So the first one being sort of that feedback loop, right? If you think about the product life cycle, the discovery aspect of it and understanding what users are doing, looking at the data, and then kind of post-launch, right? And understanding what's going on there. So there can be a little bit of an intersection here in terms of discovery, who owns that, who's talking to users, who's getting that user information, who's analyzing the data, right? And so there can just be a little bit of an inherent tension there in terms of feeling a sense of ownership around that. The next is user flows and prototyping. I remember when I took some basics of product management course, right? We all downloaded Balsamic and we're using that to create wireframes. But some designers may feel a lot of ownership over the wireframes, right? And why are you giving me these weird sketches of what you think this should look like? So that can also be a little bit of an overlap. Creating user flows. I love to create user flows because that's the way that my mind thinks. I can't just write down a bunch of words. So creating those user flows is a way to help me communicate to my design team, to my development team, even our stakeholders. But again, that might be an overlap between product designers and them creating user flows in their own way to help feed into their designs. Lastly, user stories can be a little bit of an intersection. Also, engineers can kind of have a little bit of attention in here as well. So understanding the work that the engineers are working on, kind of creating that acceptance criteria. I had a product manager who the designer created all of the user stories. Sounds great. Everything looked pretty, but there were some issues in terms of like connections with APIs or some of the deeper pieces there or integrations with other aspects of work. So I think there needs to be a healthy balance there, right, of the types of user stories they're creating. And I don't think it's a one size fits all situation. And acceptance criteria is important from, I think, all views, right? From a product design perspective, you want to make sure the designs are maybe as pixel perfect as we want them to be. You're not breaking some of that. But then there's also from a product acceptance criteria, looking at the user, looking at their journey and where it fits overall. Cool. So we'll talk about the first sort of practice that I try to employ, which is using data as a tiebreaker. So as a product manager, and I'm sure all of you feel a lot of ownership over your product and that it's your baby. Prior to me having my second child, my first launch of my big product was my second child. So I think that we feel ownership over it. And so we tend to think of like, we know what's best for the product. We know what's best for the user, right? And from a design perspective, they feel ownership over the designs they're creating, the users that they're creating those designs for. Excuse me. And so I think both sides also have a little bit of instinct, right? You, as a product manager, feel like you have a little bit of instinct around how users are using your product, the people that you've built your product for. And on the design side, there's best practices from a UX side and UI side, right? And they've got their instinct of how somebody might use something or patterns that are out there existing, right? Like we don't need to create everything from scratch. So really, this can create this inherent tension of deciding what's right for the product and what's right for the end user. So I like to just really take a step back then and be like, okay, you have your opinion, I have mine. What's the data say? And there's so many tools out there, right? Like you can use Full Story, you can use Hotjar to like see how consumers are interacting with things. You can use heat map, you can use just straight data in terms of like drop off points. And I think that it's important then to like take all of those things together. So your opinions, right? Your instinct that you might have and overlay that with the data and start to think about, okay, this is the direction we should be heading in because this is the data, this is what the data is telling us. For an example, right? Product designers tend to like want to have this like utopia. Also, is there a product designer in here? I'm sorry. I'm speaking from my perspective. Sometimes there is this idea of like a utopia, right? Like we've got this big, beautiful product that we've designed. And parts of that might be improving, let's say, this portion of the login experience. But we don't have the resources for that, especially at a startup coming from that point of view, right? Like I've got very limited resources. We're trying to get a lot done. So yes, that's great. You're right. That probably will help the user experience a little bit better. But let's look at the data then and start to think about how many people is this actually impacting? Are we seeing people actually be frustrated here, or is this really more of a nice to have and we can kind of build on it later? I think at the end of all of this as well is really like not to take it personally. So I don't think there's not a winner or a loser, right? Like somebody's decision isn't like the best one necessarily because they made it. And so we really, again, like taking that step back and like, how is this affecting our overall company or the business objective? And using that data to just like tie it into the changes that you're making or the decisions that you're making. So does anyone have an example of like an issue that they might have where this might tie into that, or a scenario in which you're facing that this could be helpful? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm director of product management for my company, and we got 3 product owners. And our designers, or no offense, they would not take if you just did any sort of prototype of what your ideas were, even though at times that helps product owners or conceptualize what they're thinking, the problem is, and what they might think as an initial set of solutions. I have to do a lot of referring between product design and my team to make sure. Yes, we have a UX team, a design team, and absolutely your job is to go and validate all of that. But please don't get offended if somebody's coming with their sketch because they have visible features.
Yeah.
How would you?
Yeah, I think and that's a very like tangible, right, of that intersection of kind of having those flows and prototyping. I honestly, the way that I approach it is this is the way that I work. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too, right? But this is the way that I need to think about this. In order to provide you the best requirements that I can, this is sort of the way that I need to put that down on paper. I'm not offended if you change it, if you do anything with it, right? But like, this is my initial thought and pass at this. Let's work together to build on top of that. And I think just like framing it that, right? Like, this is a starting point. Let's collaborate and let's like keep going on it.
That totally makes sense, and that's when you're those second bullet points, right? Balancing instinct with knowledge and best practice, and more importantly, data, right? So if you say this is, you got to support that, and that's what I try to coach my product owners. So then you're providing more of a balance and where you came from.
Yeah. And I think it's like taking all those things too, right? And creating the narrative around it. And crafting that narrative in a way then that everyone's aligned around the problem we're trying to solve, the solution we're trying to get to, right? Whether it's like, I'm not telling you what the solution should be, but I'm telling you the end result of where we need to go. So like, how do we connect A to B there? Yeah. Yes, exactly. And like, that's why the don't take it personally. I know I have an ego about my product, right? It's my baby. But we've got to like, I think sometimes just remind ourselves, take a step back, and everybody needs to do this, right? I'm speaking from a product management perspective, but like, I think from a designer perspective too, just like take a step back, you know, no one is trying to like offend you by any means, but we just want to make sure we're getting to like the same place.
I think as long as everybody has their reasons for wanting to make those changes.
Yes.
Whether you're product management or design, and that way you can kind of collaborate a little bit better, understand their point of view, I understand my point of view, and how can we work together.
Yeah.
So to me, it's like, as long as you have your reasons, you're not just saying, I like this because I
Right.
I like this because of A, B, and C.
Yeah.
And especially if you have data behind it, so you can't view it, this is what I found, this is actually solid.
Exactly.
So, to me, it's like, as long as you have your reasons and thought out reasons, you know, being as a designer, I can easily get along with product management. If you're just shouting out things without any substance behind it,
Yes.
then I'm the question. Then
Yeah. And I don't think it should be a like, cause I said so, right? Like, I'm not your mother. But I think that also talking about those reasons together in a collaborative way. So you're not just saying like, here's my reasons, this is why you should do it, right? But like, here's my reasons, let's talk about it a little bit. Let's see like where this balances with your, yeah.
So I have a question. I'm going to be new to product management, but I worked as a graphic designer for years, but I'm printing magazines. Is it not feasible to have a process mapped out of how you all work together? Like, am I being idealistic?
No. We'll talk about process. Yes, a little bit idealistic. I think everybody intends like to set out on this beautiful process and this journey. I think what's important, right, is like as you're doing that to make changes as that process isn't working for you. And from my world a little bit from a startup, like we're moving so quickly that sometimes we're just like, we gotta like overshoot this part of the process because we need engineers to be working on this now. And so like we need to get things for them to be working on. And so I think that can happen. No. I don't want to like, I never want to like bypass them, but I think it's really just understanding the direction that we need to move in, right? Or, hey, I know you're going to hate this, but we really got to get this like piece of feature out. Can we just like quickly come up with a design and we can come back to it later to make it better? Is usually my lie there. Yeah.
Some kind of concept. So, yeah. So I wouldn't, and all designers are not illustrators or drawers anyway.
Hmm.
So, you know, I don't know why people that
Yeah.
you're thinking on paper.
Yeah, and I think that that's a little bit of a tension, right? Is that like product designers are not graphic designers, right? They're not just here to draw pretty pictures. There's more thought behind it. There's, you know, the UI, UX, the research behind it, the architecture. And I think that's something that like as product managers, we need to think about too, right? And like they're not just order takers. So we shouldn't just deliver orders in that way because that's just like setting the relationship up to kind of be, you know, feeling that way.
I so I'm a very data-driven product manager, and I sometimes feel that the data is an icebreaker. It's a little bit unfair to the design team because we have all of the data as the product managers, and the design team doesn't necessarily have all of the tools to come up with that data that supports the process. I'm curious, are there things that you do to help the designers like, think more strategically about data
Yeah, I mean, I think as part of this, right, is that like we shouldn't be gatekeeping any of that data and we should create ways in which we can share that data. So we have sessions where we'll go through full story together with our design team, with our engineers, with our product folks, right? And like walk through some of these journeys to see what people are doing live together and have that conversation together. And creating reporting structures, or like capabilities that they can kind of pull that same data. So they're not coming to you to say, how many people are dropping off at this point? They can kind of self-service it because then I think self-servicing takes out that gatekeeping and allows them to feel comfortable, right? And understanding of they're getting this data from here. I can get it from the same place. Now we can kind of talk about it on a level playing field.
I might even like ask you why the designers do not have access to that data. I feel like as PM, you're always trying to like educate the entire suite within the company. So like trying to uncover what they do not have access to or do not understand.
I think it's more of the understand. But they certainly have access to on we use log on.
Yeah.
Full story, right? We have our funnel set up there, but probably we haven't taken enough time to like walk through like how you actually make some decisions with this.
Yes.
So it's there. It's not like I'm saying like, no, I'm not giving you keys to the kingdom.
Yeah.
It's more of like how do I use this
Right. And again, I think it's like part of that collaboration, right? And taking that, I think that in taking that time to help them understand will make your life easier because now they're on the same page of where you're getting that data from and how you're like deriving the pieces of information from it. Okay. Okay. So kind of the next strategy is thinking about balancing work ahead. This is a very specific pain point that I am facing right now. And I have kind of a little bit, right? When we think about product management, we talk about like strategic versus tactical. I'm at a startup right now. We are moving so fast. I am not focusing enough time on the strategic, right? Like I am in the weeds on a tactical perspective. Kind of part of that problem is that our design team is looking to work ahead of engineers, working to work ahead so that way as we think about our roadmap, right, they've got pieces in place and we're not just scrambling and I'm not telling them that at the 11th hour, I need this designed. For us, we've got our roadmap built out probably like 6 to 7 months because I know there's going to be a pivot at some point. And so I don't want our executive team to like see all these things we're going to build like a year from now when most likely we aren't. And so that kind of makes it difficult though, right? From a designer's perspective to be like, how can I work ahead if I don't know what we're going to be working on? And you haven't given me enough information to like start to build on that. So what can happen is a little bit of like cowboying, where they're just like, oh, I have this great idea that we should start thinking about. So like, I'm going to go do some research. I'm going to talk to these stakeholders. All of a sudden the stakeholders are coming to me and being like, oh, we're building this. I had no idea. And I was like, no, we're not. Please stop. And I think that's like, there's a balance, right? Like I want to foster the creativity and the exploration of my design team. I don't want to stifle that, but I want to make sure that there's a little bit of guardrails. So something that we do is just, even if it's like an idea out there, right, is a one pager at the very least of like the problem statement, the solution, or the opportunity that we have, some competitors, some sort of framework or guidance that somebody can look at from a designer, from anywhere really, and understand like, here's where we're thinking about where this might go. You know, we've put some thought into it, and it doesn't need to be like crazy, right? You don't need to build out your entire requirements because you don't have time to do that right now. But by providing that one pager, by making that accessible, you're then giving guardrails. And so you're not getting questions about, you know, you building some great fancy thing that's not coming for a while. I also think what's helpful is like holding proactive, like cross-functional discussions with engineering, with designers, with product, to be like, where do we see things going? You know, what are your ideas like in the medium and the long term, and kind of empowering everybody. And again, sort of like that gatekeeping, right? Like, we don't need to like own the roadmap only and be the only ones that can change it. And there needs to be that collaboration, because I think that's how we can foster that innovation. We aren't the only ones that can innovate, and we have to like make sure that we're being inclusive, so that way we can build a better end product and deliver better things. And so by holding some of these conversations a little bit earlier than you might want to, because you might not have all the answers, right? Like, I hate not having the answers. And so sometimes I'm a little afraid to like be having these conversations about a future thing, because I'm like, I don't know how we're going to do that yet. We're going to do it. I'm just not sure. But allowing that like flexibility and that conversation to happen. And with that too, just sort of feedback. So if the design team's working on something that's like future far out, we don't have strict requirements around it, show me what you've got. Let's talk about it. You know, that's a great idea. I think this could be separate. Let's like focus on this path. And just like helping to refocus, giving that early and often feedback, so they're not building high fidelity mocks on something that just like we aren't going to do. But giving a little bit of direction early on, even though you're not necessarily ready to like take a deep dive in it, there's still the ability to work ahead and provide some of that. So any questions, thoughts, issues? Yeah.
I mean, I love what you said there, but how do you balance your time with 50 other things with happening? How do I constant feedback?
Yeah. Async feedback has honestly been a big saver for us. So we use Figma. So they'll just shoot me a Figma. I'll leave some comments when I have time. They'll shoot me a Loom, right? Walking through an interaction. So we do a lot of async before we have an actual in-person meeting. So that way the meeting is a little bit more efficient in terms of like, okay, here's the comments I left and the notes I left. Now let's talk about like the redirection there. So that's been really helpful for us, is just, there's so many tools now, you know, that we have available to us. And so making sure we're using those tools, using them efficiently, has really helped to like cut down my time on there, because then I don't have to provide feedback right away. I could think about it, you know, I can kind of like schedule it into my week, because I totally get you. There's so many things going on. But that allows a little bit more flexibility to not be like giving on the spot feedback, but taking some time to think about it, come back to it, and then like meeting on it once you've got more questions. Good. Cool. Anything else here? Okay. So that ties a little bit actually into my next slide. So thank you. Which is design feedback, right? So something that has happened for me is all of a sudden we've gone from like wireframe straight to high fidelity. And I'm like, whoa, what the hell is this? This is not what, like, this isn't where we needed to go. And I think that having this design feedback and having a loop and a process around this is so important in breaking that tension, because then you're not like giving feedback too late. You're providing that direction in a way that they need it, in a way that meets them where they're at, in order to be able to like just create a more efficient process there. So I really think early and often feedback is important. So that way you're crafting that direction up front. And then as we go into high fidelity mocks, there needs to be a little bit less, right? It can be a little bit more about smaller interaction pieces or smaller design pieces versus just the vision of where this is going. And I think, again, that collaboration, we've done some like workshops and live sessions. So while async is great for some of these smaller things, I think that workshops and like live sessions can be incredibly helpful from them understanding how you're thinking about something, right? And kind of digging deep into that. I recently did a workshop with one of my product designers, you know, on all of the unhappy paths that were tied to something. And so we just like took it screen by screen and said, like, here's the ways this could go wrong. Next screen, here's the way this could go wrong. And that was so helpful. I was like, oh, I totally forgot that this can go wrong this way, right? But B, helped her to understand how I think about it, you know, the ways that this could happen. And then when we had our high fidelity designs out of that, we had all of these unhappy paths. And it wasn't just a happy path with like maybe a few. So helpful for when we got into engineering, because we weren't sometimes I feel that there are, you know, the engineers are like, well, what about when this happens? What about when this happens? And then, you know, like we're scrambling to like track down designs there. And so that workshop was so helpful. It helped me like realize missed requirements that I had. It helped her understand where I'm coming from, what we're trying to do. And then really, I think it just helped from an end result, just us be more efficient because engineering had everything that they need. They didn't have to come back to us a lot. The other, I think, really important thing is constructive feedback to create that direction, right? I don't think that any designer, I'm going to speak for you guys a little bit. But I don't think that anybody wants to hear like, yeah, looks great. Okay. You know, we're good. If there's no feedback, then how closely did you look at it, right? Like, I'm not perfect. So there's got to be some feedback. And so I think that making sure that you're giving that feedback in a constructive way, so that way there is that guidance. You're not just steaming down a lane that you think that we need to go, and we get to the end and it's like, oh, well, wait, this like wasn't quite what we wanted. So now we have to restart it. And sometimes I feel bad, right? Like, you've built this utopia. I think it's perfect. I think it's beautiful, but we can't do all of this right now. Like, let's take a look at the MVP slice. Where can we just do this like narrow bit right now? How can we get to the future and make sure we're thinking about the future? But like, this is just the part that we need to do right now. And so having that conversation though, and so they understand like where I'm coming from and the whys behind it, and like, save this, we'll do it later, I promise. But like, let's just keep going down this train of thought. And so I think that feedback is important because again, you're going to get to the end and you want it to be as efficient as possible. Like, you don't want to have that back and forth at the end when you're trying to get tickets created for engineering so they can start working on it so we can deliver it, right? Like, do the hard work up front so that way later on it's a little bit easier for you.
I think feedback sometimes is good in seeing what needs to be improved, but also it's good for confirmation from the designer, from the product, say, hey, I see where you're going here. This does make sense, so that it kind of confirms my designs as well.
Yes.
The product is as well. So then we can move on from that point, and then obviously focus on more things that need to be.
Totally.
So I'm thinking your premise is like you already have your requirements so-called written up and the design comes after that. Is that correct or something?
Yes.
So we are having a level of new leaders in town. So C is wanting to have design as a visible design as well as the requirement design done in the panel, which kind of creates friction.
Yeah.
I'm trying to convince her in much nicer ways that you may have to do the requirement at least some way in form, 80% requirement. So after design, it may change slightly because it didn't make sense.
Yeah, I would disagree with that approach of doing it in parallel, because then you're chasing down two rabbits that are running in opposite directions potentially, and you got to like corral them together.
Yeah. And that's where a lot of our pitches are happening because they're writing the requirement, that's the story, and the design is not matching
Yeah. What are those requirement artifacts? Like, are they, like one pagers? Are they like fully fleshed, like product requirement documents? Like, is there a balance that can maybe be had where there's a lighter requirements built out that everyone can agree to, and then we can kind of move in parallel?
So we do my high level scope. So these are things we want to accomplish, and then that's where designer taking and making sure they visualize it so we can then write stories on top of it.
Yeah,
That's how we approach.
Yeah.
We don't want to 100% dictate
for sure.
in other ways, right? For product, it's about what we envision need to happen.
Yeah.
User story, right? The user journey. And my team is unfortunately very young. So the time state, our end designers are much senior.
Ah, got it.
So there is that friction, and I have to constantly stay the middleman.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm gonna work some ways.
But I'll talk a little bit more about processes too, and then in the next slide. But yeah, I think that you can create some loose process to be like, this is the way we should do this because, and again, like thinking about it globally, this will make everyone's lives easier at the end of it. Like, let's try to think to our future selves. Will our future selves be happy or unhappy? And kind of build on it from that perspective. So everyone's got that same perspective where you're not just like, no, we can't do it that way, but like, here's why.
Yeah, I just, maybe something that could be helpful. So used to run, I used to run product managers, like head product managers, now I run a UX team, but I also was on the business side funding these products too. I think one of the ways to kind of help prioritize is I introduced this kind of phased approach of MVP. User can use it minimally, right? And then MLP, user actually really like it. And so it just phases into this like prioritization of like the product manager has to get something out. The designers really want to create something that's lovable, so it becomes more iterative. And it's not, and it feels like this isn't final, right? So it is truly MVP, and we're going to continually enhance it. It's helped our teams be able to say, let's just do it in a way that the customer or user can use it, and then the next phase is we're really going to roll it out and spend a little bit more time. But as a business, I need you to have the MVP out because I got to start seeing, growth or revenue or things like that. So that's one way the teams kind of had to manage and balance the tension between delivery and truly adoption.
Yeah. And I think what's important, right, is to be like, this isn't going to go in the backlog abyss where we just don't touch it or talk about it or look at it for months, years, maybe, right? And so like making sure you're intentionally prioritizing it, because I also don't want my designers to feel like, cool, you say that every single time and we never get to like where we're building the lovable part, right? And so I think having a roadmap that might be a little bit more smaller and having that with your design team in terms of like, this isn't like the strategic roadmap. Here's some of the tactical things that we can do. We've built this MVP part on our roadmap. This is where I envision we can maybe start to slowly pull in some of these other pieces to make it incrementally better. And having that so that there's a little bit more trust there, right? And that's breaking the tension by like having that trust together, and that they trust you that when you say, we'll do this later, we actually are going to do it later, or have an idea of like when. And I don't just feel like you just blow off all my ideas and just do what you want anyways. All right. So this is kind of the last one. I mean, I think that this applies to literally any working relationship you have. But since we're talking about breaking the tension here, I wanted to kind of call it out. So strengths and weaknesses, we all have them, right? We all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses. So I think in creating this relationship, and in order to break the tension, also, I don't know how many times I've said that word. So in order to do that, right, we need to, I think, first identify and amplify each other's strengths. So looking at your design, looking at yourself, right? Like, what are the strengths that we each have that we can use to then mold our process? Because I don't think that there's a process or like a method that is a one size fits all for each team or even each designer. think that like you might have individuals designers that like have a different personality and might work a certain way, right? Or have strengths that are different from each other. So really just identifying those and then amplifying those so that way, hey, you know what? You're really good at this piece. So I'd love if you could take more of that, right? And I'll focus on this other piece. Especially for me, from like a startup perspective, we're trying to do 100 things at once. So I love to offload things as much as I can. So identifying some of those strengths, right? Like I don't need to sit in every user research session. I'll sit in a couple. You guys are good to run those. Let's work on like the best way that you can analyze. Give me the synopsis of it so we can start to make decisions off of it. But like, I don't need to be there for everyone. I can't. But you like to do them. So please continue to do them. And same with weaknesses, right? So I've got a product designer who he's totally visionary. He loves to look at kind of like where we can go, has these big ideas. His attention to detail is sometimes very lacking. I have a high attention to detail. And so we just know that, right? And so we work that into our process. So when he delivers to me sort of like the high fidelity mock, I know that I have the expectation of like, there are going to be some details that are off here. I'll mark them, I'll call them out, we'll address them. But like knowing that and knowing that myself then can help me not have my expectations to a place where like this is going to be completely pixel perfect. We can just like go on it. I know that I'm going to have that little bit of feedback session, but then I'm not setting myself up for failure, right? And just like expecting that it's going to be totally done when I know that there's other pieces. So again, strengths and weaknesses there. And balancing like personalities and work methods. Again, anybody that you work with, right? You want to build that best relationship. So everyone is a little different. Everyone works a little bit differently. Every designer works differently. Every product manager works differently. What you do for one might not work for another. And I think that in order to break the tension, like let's look at each other like people, right? And understand each other so that way we can build our working relationship on top of that. And build the processes on top of that, because then we can understand like how the ebb and flow needs to work in order to be able to like efficiently deliver this end result that we want. And we've kind of touched on it throughout the previous slides, but that collaboration I think is so important. I don't ever think it should be tossing something over the fence. Here you go, take it, toss it back when it's done, right? From a design side, from an engineering side, I feel that that delivers an end product that is disjointed. By having that collaboration, by having the understanding of the problem, of where we're trying to go, then I think it just builds a better product and consumers like will feel the impact of that. What do you guys got here? Nothing. Cool. I think we have 10 minutes left. Maybe? Okay. Yeah.
I have a question. What have you seen as the best team model for product and design? I've had experiences where consultants come in and they work on kind of a shorter, medium term design project. I've seen it where we have a pool of design resources, sort of who's available jumps onto the Scrum team for a few sprints. And I'm curious about models that you've seen that have worked the best for harmonious product design relationships.
Yeah. I mean, from my experience, I've found that sort of the product focused team is helpful, especially with like designers, because there's not a ton of context switching that way, right? And you're seeing this product go from like A to B and have the understanding of the A to B. Whereas sometimes with jumping, it could be like you lose the context. You have to start over to understand the reasons why behind it or understand the pain points. And then you're like starting from scratch, right? So from an efficiency perspective, I feel like having it based around the product or suite of products just helps to like keep that going as smoothly as possible. And we do switch it up, right? So that way you're not just learning one product or like only have an understanding, or right? So like maybe after 9 months, a year, we kind of like rotate it out a little bit. We get fresh eyes, fresh perspective on it. and then like everyone is getting that knowledge. But that's just like what's worked best for me.
I was gonna say that we use the embedded team model as well. We used to have the pool model, and you mentioned earlier about relationships, and whenever you use a pool, you start using resources, things like that.
Yeah.
People, essentially. I think that having them involved in daily stand-ups, the occasional like hangouts that happen, builds that relationship.
Yeah, and I think too is like it's not just like all a business relationship, right? But like some of those other pieces like create context clues. So like if you are just hanging out and you're kind of talking about like the vision of the product, or hey, I heard we're like onboarding this new partner and this is what that's going to mean for us. That helps everybody to be clued into that so they can like do their jobs better. Yeah.
How big is your development or other pods or teams that you have? Is that you just one?
So currently at the startup that I'm at, we've got 2 designers and then we've got 4 engineering teams of different products. So kind of each designer works on 2 of those products. Previously at a company which was larger, I think we had 7 or 8 teams with a dedicated designer for each of those teams.
So when you say designer, do you also have UX that does more of research
Yeah.
that feeds into design?
Yeah, so ours was like a mix, so like UX, UI. I have not had the money, right? I haven't had the budget necessarily to split those as much as we would like to. I think the startup that I'm at, like as we grow, I think we'll be able to do that. And we've talked about that, which is good. Like we're having those conversations. So that is end goal for sure. The way that my product designers do it right now is they'll take 1 week a month to fully dedicate to sort of UX to research pieces, block it off on their calendar, right? Like make sure that all the deliverables are out. And so giving them that time to focus on that versus trying to do it a little bit here, a little bit there has been helpful for us with the resource constraints, people constraints.
I do find that very helpful to support like the research UX strategy with business process.
Yeah.
Because I will tell you, it's a reflection. It's technology, and you really need the business to be tied into with the right processes to support
Yeah.
the digital service. And so usually having that team that helps stitch digital and business processes.
Yeah, so I will tell you, like in my situation, we got 2 UX, we got 2 engineering team, but UX team only wants to do just research. We don't have anybody doing UI, so whenever we
Oh,
push it out there, it becomes a conflict. And unfortunately, they don't report to me, but directly reports to my VP.
okay.
And my VP is like holding tight fist, even though I should be their sort of leader to guide them with the work.
Yeah.
So, and also, hopefully we can get a little bit foresighted in our strategy and the roadmap. So to your point, give a month, and every 6 months or so, allocate certain time to do research.
Yeah.
And then use that to do the design. Every time there's a contract, whenever we want UI, a design role, users will say, I'm a UX guy. Why are you asking me to design? I mean, so we are time and money as well.
Yeah.
And I got to leverage that somehow. Say, here's the contract. I need money. I need people to do the work. Otherwise, we'll constantly have this conflict.
Definitely. And maybe outlining like the needs, right? And where, if this is what the definition of this role is, then either we need a new role or we need to expand the definition of this role in order to fit what we're trying to do, because we can't deliver the product that you need and want if we're not able to do this.
When you're in a startup, constant startup mode, like when money's tight, that's
Yeah.
just constant.
Everyone's got to be a little scrappy.
But the thing is, if you do this crappy work and I give a little bit of power to some of the design, right, to your product, that becomes a conflict for the UX.
Yeah.
No, we did not do a good job. So what I'm trying to do is to have them work with my design system 100%. everybody. You leverage everything. from
Totally.
the system, so you're not going out of the box.
Yeah.
But company doesn't see the value in the design system.
Oh, I get that. We just went through a big part of that, where yeah, we implemented a design system. Why haven't we delivered this yet? Right? Like, I used a lot of visualization to show like, here's how much quicker we could develop if we had this design system. Here's the ways that it's going to help you. A lot of like what the conversations that I needed to have is, you want dynamic fees. Great. Without the design system, this is going to take us 6 months to build. With a design system, this will take us a month to build and test. And so putting into, I think from a business perspective, right, like time, cost, those types of things, not just like, this will make everyone's lives better. Yes, but like, here's how specifically it's going to make our lives better.
Right, but that, we have made all of that cases, but again.
I get it. Yeah.
It becomes a very challenging issue, and I know engineering team is way too spend all that on getting all the resources, but not putting a product in UX number.
Yeah.
But anyhow, it's just.
Yeah, and I think like going back to right, like they want to focus that time by maybe saying, okay, by coming to sort of that collaborative agreement of take a week every few months to focus on that, but in the meantime, like we have to get products out, right? Like we've got to build things, we've got to get engineering stuff. So let's do it. But also, I want you to be able to do this too. So like, here's the dedicated time you can to have to that.
I give power to all the companies that have a little foresight, even if it's 3 months foresight. We have constantly been ensuring start designing and developing in the same. quarter.
Yeah. Which is creates inefficiencies though, because then you get to it, you're like, wait, we forgot about this part.
Right. And then our leadership.
Yeah.
So does that weak model actually work?
Yeah.
It has so far. They also knowing the week that they've got and like having it in the calendar allows them to like know what they need to focus on to wrap up, to have that week available to them. And then the important part of that week is making sure that we've defined what is the outcome of that week. How are you going to present this to myself, to the other stakeholders, right? And I think that was an important part. Like, it's not just like, here's a week to go do this, but like, here's a week and here's what the outcome of that week is so that we can act on it, right? Or make changes based on it. And it's not just like a week to do, talk to people.
I mean, every environment is different for us. We do a lot of external. We got to recruit people from
Yeah,
outside world. So that, you got to build that in.
definitely.
You said otherwise just give a week to UX because, well, this would have been done in a week. It's not fair enough to them.
Yeah. And so like by knowing the week that we're going to have, right, we can start to recruit, we can start to look for people, start to schedule them for that week, give people enough ample time so we're not chasing it. So it allows us to be more proactive in it in a way as well. All right. Well, I think I'm at time. Thank you all so much.